Hi, I'm Michelle Kaiser, and I'm an occupational therapist. And I've had a few families recently just asking me for some additional information about sensory integration or sensory processing. And so I'm put together a short little presentation just as a very basic introduction. This is not by any means complete information. It's not um, reviewing all of the latest research. It's just kind of a basic introduction to the concept or theory of sensory processing. I work with little ones birth to 3 years of age, and so that's kind of the age group that I'm considering when I'm sharing this information, but definitely people of all ages, including adults, struggle with sensory processing. And so give me just a second here and I will share my screen with you and see if I can begin this presentation. Okay. So what is, let's see, I think I want to go back one. There we go. Sensory integration, or what's really kind of be called now sensory processing, is really just the neurological process that occurs as our body takes in information from the environment, and as the brain also takes in information even from within our own bodies. So when that information comes into the brain organizes it and tries to make sense of it, and then very quickly determines how the body should respond. This was originally kind of coined or developed by Dr. Jean Ayres, I believe in the 70s. And since then, of course, much research has been done and more objective information is able to be researched on this. So one example of how this whole process works of taking in information, going into the brain and responding to it, is if you think about if you touch a hot surface, that information goes very quickly from the pads of your finger really quickly up to your brain, and then your brain decides what it should do very quickly and responds right away so that you take your hand away from the hot surface, which would prevent further injury. In addition to that, your brain is also learning information, determining like maybe how your body moves quickest, and most importantly, cognitively deciding to try to avoid touching hot surfaces. One of the things that when information comes from an area in our body and that information goes to our brain, this is something really interesting. Those pathways are called tracks, and there's ascending and descending tracks. And most of the tracks, not all of them, but most of the tracks in the body that go to the brain and go from the brain back to our body cross over from one side to the other. So if you touch the hot surface with your right hand, that pathway eventually will cross over to the left side of your brain. And then in order to respond back to the right side, the left side will cross over again to the right side. So when we talk about crossing midline and the importance of being able to process and understand information by crossing over midline, this is just one example of why, as occupational therapists and other providers, we're looking at how we can integrate both sides of the brain and the body. What kind of information does the brain exactly integrate? Most of us are familiar with our brain taking in information, like when we learned when we were younger, the 5 senses, taste, touch, smell, sight, all of that information is taken in by our bodies, our senses, and taken up to the brain, where the brain processes it, organizes it, tries to make sense of it, and then decides how our body should respond. Some of the information that our brains receive is lesser known, and you'll hear other therapists talk about movement or vestibular processing. So how does your body How does your brain understand how your body's moving and respond to that? Does it feel like it's falling? Does it feel like your posture is upright? Does it sense your position in space even when your eyes are closed? Which kind of goes into proprioceptive input. So how does your body know, your brain know how your body is positioned even when your eyes are closed? You can close your eyes and move your body a certain way, and your brain still understands where it is in space because of this proprioceptive knowledge that it takes in. And then kind of an area that I've been kind of interested in lately and getting more information about is interoception. And like this little picture on the slide has, like, that's information that your body gets from like your kidneys, your heart, your lungs, your stomach, all of those, organs and systems. Your brain is getting information from them as well. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, people respond differently to the amounts of information that our brain gets in those areas as well. So when you think about sensory processing, remember, it's not just the five senses that your brain's trying to figure out how to process. It's also the input around movement, joint position, that interoception information as well. So we all have sensory integration and processing going on. It never stops. Our brain is constantly, even when we're sleeping, taking in information and deciding on how to respond to it. So what is going on, or what does it mean when we talk about sensory processing disorder or sensory processing dysfunction? What this is it's something that occurs when the brain is not really making the appropriate sense of the information that it receives. It causes the person to struggle with usually both areas, but it can struggle with also just individually discrimination of sensory information. So your brain's trying to figure out, what was that? What was that input, and where did it happen? And also respond to the information that it does take in the way that we call is adaptive or appropriate or matches the situation. What happens a lot of times with sensory processing disorder is that our bodies over respond or under respond to information, which can really cause challenges in a little one's ability to engage in day-to-day activities and relationships. So there's two factors to consider with sensory processing. One is that each of us have different thresholds or thresholds or levels of input that we need in order to respond for each of those areas of input, like we just talked about. So each of us has kind of our own threshold of when things kind of fire off a response. And so what that means is, how much input does it take for the brain to really register that input? Enough that it can make sense of it. And again, I might have a high threshold for maybe touch, like it takes a lot of touch for me to say, oh, someone just gave me a hug. But I might have a really low threshold or tolerance to sound. Like even just background sounds are hard for me to get used to, maybe, or the sound of someone whispering is really abrasive to me. So a high threshold means I need a lot of this input in order to understand what's happening or for my brain to make sense of it or try to. And a low threshold means, an example could be, just thinking about eating. I forgot I wrote this example in here, but high threshold would be, hey, I need a lot of food in my mouth in order to really know, like, where are my gums, my teeth, my tongue. And then if I have a low threshold, I might take really small or tiny bites because if I take a normal sized bite, it's too much for me and it makes me want to gag. So those are kind of some examples of threshold. The other factor is response. We tend to be either sensory seeking or sensory avoiding. Once the brain receives the input that it does from whatever tract or whatever information, how does it mean? This means how does it inform the body in how it should respond? So if you're sensory avoiding, your brain's saying, hey, whoa, that was too much information. Why don't you avoid that? Or if you're sensory seeking, your brain says, hey, I didn't get quite enough information. I didn't quite understand when you were just moving around a little bit in your chair. I really need you to move around a lot so that I know where your body's at in space. Because when you're sitting still, I don't know where your body is and I'm not sure what to do with that. So I'm going to need you, your brain's telling your body this, I'm going to need you to move a lot so that I can kind of see where you're at. So those are just a couple little examples. And again, these are different for every single type of input. I might be avoiding of touch, but I might be seeking lights and visual information. So it gets really detailed and involved, and it's pretty fascinating. So you maybe have talked about or heard fight or flight responses. And like from the biology sense of things, what that means is when your body receives information that it determines is threatening, is too much, or is like a strong amount of information, it decides pretty quickly, like, am I going to fight to survive this situation, or am I going to withdraw and fight and flight? So when the brain is receiving information, it does so rapidly, and it must make quick decisions. When brains have a low threshold and are trying to avoid input, but it still keeps getting that input, information actually is accumulative and it keeps adding. So a little one who has a low threshold might start the day maybe okay, maybe they didn't sleep well, so their threshold is a little bit lower, but maybe they didn't eat a good breakfast, and so they might be a little bit hangry, and so their threshold's a little bit lower. Then maybe they go to a grandma's or someone's they don't normally go to, and they kind of get a little bit more hugging and touching, and that kind of lowers their threshold. And then you end the day by going to Walmart or the grocery store. And so all of that is accumulative. And so it keeps adding on. And eventually, sometimes right away, but eventually in a cumulative manner, your brain will decide, I need to respond now, and we need to figure out what to do. So just a little parenting tip on this. These are really tough times when your kids react in this way, in this fight or flight response. It can be embarrassing if they, throw things, push things away, try to run away, try to avoid a situation. It's hard for us. We want to parent them, say, hey, that wasn't okay, which definitely there's a place for all of that. We don't want that behavior to continue if it was not appropriate for the situation. But just know that those emotional and really stressful times are not good times to do a lot of parenting or talking or negotiating or trying to do reasoning with them. During those instances, and your occupational therapist can kind of help you go through those sensory experiences to determine if that's what the situation was. But those are really times to calm your child, remove them from the situation, assure them that they're safe. And then later, when the timing is right and they're in what we call a just right state of alertness, those are times to say, wow, when grandma leaned over to give you a kiss, that was hard for you. And it looked like you were pretty stressed out. Let's talk about, what we can do about that. And if they're older and have the language, you can sometimes talk about those things. But when we're talking about infants and toddlers, that's something we have to kind of have conversations with ourselves and figure out how to help our child navigate those situations. So why does sensory integration matter? Why does sensory processing matter? You know, hopefully just by those few examples, you can kind of see that if a child has an over responsiveness or a low threshold or a high threshold, all of those factors impact how the child is able to respond and interact and engage in daily routines with you. And so just looking at this pyramid, this is kind of what we call a learning pyramid, but you can see at the very base or foundation of this pyramid is the central nervous system. And at the very foundation are these very basic sensory systems, those five senses, but also kind of looking at proprioceptive input. Actually, tactile and vestibular and proprioceptive are some of the very earliest systems to develop in utero. And already, even before a little one is born, they're receiving this type of input and they're starting to create pictures of themselves in their bodies and how they respond to different kinds of input. So it's pretty fascinating how foundational and basic these systems are. Moving on up, you start to see how your body motor-wise begins to use that information. And then beyond that, you start to really get to some higher level skills around language acquisition, eye-hand coordination, how we adjust posturally to different situations. And even beyond that, gets to that very top part of the learning, which is academic learning, behaviors, and participation in daily living skills and activities. So the challenge is that sometimes children will have, say, difficulty with language skills and being a part of daily living activities. And it's really hard because as interventionists and parents, a lot of times we'll just want to target just maybe the language or just the eye-hand coordination. Generally, there's oftentimes challenges or difficulties in these areas below. And so what's frequently a part of a child's therapy program or early intervention program is, yes, focusing on those specific skills in areas of language and eye-hand coordination and activities of daily living, such as dressing and eating. But also at the same time, there is a emphasis on simultaneously trying to build up these other areas, brought to awareness of both sides of the body, motor planning, understanding proprioceptive systems, and making sure your child has an integration of those. So how can you know if your child is struggling with sensory integration processing? Of course, the internet is full of lots of great resources and ideas. Some of them are less, researched as others, but definitely engaging with, early interventionists, particularly occupational therapists, generally have more training in this, but a lot of times speech language pathologists and physical therapists will as well. And some dietitians do when it comes to feeding. So it's a good thing to ask your therapist or providers what their background is in sensory processing. But you will basically use like routines-based interviews to see how is your child engaging in daily routines, how independent are they, how is their relationship with others during your daily routines. There are some specific questionnaires that we can have you fill out as caregivers. Of course, observation of your child and seeing with our own eyes how they respond to different situations and how they respond to different input. And there are a variety of evaluations and assessments that we can use to get that information as well. There are literally, I don't want to say hundreds, but there are lots and lots of common challenges that kids with sensory integration or sensory processing difficulties can face or struggle with. But these are some of the more common ones that I've seen, and that is hyper or hypoactivity, sometimes movement, excessive talking, excessive looking at lights, and other kinds of sensory seeking activities, which is the next one. Sensory sensitivity or sensory seeking behaviors that are noticed. A child that has to touch everything, smell things, prefers to just look at things that are really visually stimulating. Of course, we all have things that we prefer and enjoy and that we avoid, and that is perfectly normal. The challenge becomes when they start to impact those relationships, those behaviors, those abilities to participate in daily routines. Kids that have difficulty self-regulating, which means they have a hard time when they're upset becoming in a more just right state of alertness. Kids who overreact to situations consistently. Of course, we all have days when we overreact to challenges, but this would be kind of more of an ongoing difficulty. Sometimes difficulty in kids being flexible about their schedule or how routines are done. They only want their teeth brushed a certain way. They only want their clothes to go on a certain way. They only like routines, like good night routines, to go in a specific sequence, and become upset if someone else tries to do things differently. A lot of times daily routines like grooming, hygiene, eating, bathing, car rides can become stressful events for families and kids. But poor body awareness and coordination, excuse me, poor attention to task, poor eye-hand coordination, and then like we talked about at the very top of that pyramid, just language acquisition and learning skills. So what can you do if you are wondering if your child has sensory processing difficulties, or if a therapist or an occupational therapist has told you, hey, I think maybe we should explore some sensory processing and see if there are some areas that are difficult. Just one thing to do right away, like just starting right away, if you even suspect it, there won't be any harm done if it's not really a challenge, by just acknowledging how your child responds to sensory information. Just acknowledge, gosh, it looks like I saw you squinting when we went outside. Is it hard for you to look at the bright lights? Or, mama's really noticed when you're eating things that are kind of crunchy, that it's harder for you to enjoy those foods. So just making observations, and of course, you can find out later that maybe that wasn't completely accurate. But it's good to just be aware of how your child's responding to information that they're taking in. If you suspect that something is difficult for your child, that they're having a hard time responding to a certain kind of input, make some adaptations to those activities. Let them listen to music in headphones when you go to Walmart if the sounds are difficult, or let them wear shoes that they find more comfortable than another pair of shoes that you want them to read or wear. Take breaks from things that are difficult. If being at a family gathering is really challenging for your child, make sure and schedule in some time. Don't wait for the behaviors to occur, but schedule in some time and tell your child, after we sing happy birthday, you and mama can go outside and play on the swing for a little bit before, and then we'll come back in and have cake. Just letting your child know that there's going to be some breaks built in. And of course, I would encourage you to work with an occupational therapist to develop plans around how you can help adapt some environmental aspects and of receiving feedback, ways that you can respond to your child's reactions to input. And there's also components of sensory integration or processing therapy that can help you meet some of your child's high needs for input, but in a more appropriate way. So if your child enjoys a lot of movement and takes risks beyond their ability, like jumping off of cabinets and counters and jumping from one thing to another, maybe there's a way you can, adapt that child's need for movement, but do it in a way that's more safe and more acceptable to you. And just, I guess, understand too that you yourself have your own preferences. When you fill out those sensory profiles for your child, it's usually an eye opener to see, oh gosh, I don't really like that kind of input, or I avoid those kinds of situations, or being flexible with changes in routine is difficult for me too. So understand your own sensory preferences. Talk to those about your kids as they get older, and just let them know how you respond to them to be a good model. The last thing is just to kind of consider that even though you might be like, oh, I'm really just concerned about my child's language, be willing to be open-minded and explore the possibility of your child maybe having some challenges with sensory processing, and just understand that while working on some of those higher level skills, it can be really beneficial to simultaneously work on some sensory processing skills in that pyramid for the optimal success. One last thing before I get to the resources. Sometimes I feel like families oftentimes will say, well, if my child has sensory processing difficulties, does it mean they have autism or autism spectrum disorder? And, no, it doesn't mean that. Most children that do have autism do have some sensory processing difficulties, but not every child that has some sensory processing difficulties has autism. So even though there can be challenges that can be similar, like difficulty with flexibility, preferences for certain sensory input, there are some distinctions between the two, sensory processing disorder and autism spectrum disorder, that you really want to visit with your occupational therapist and your child's team that you're working with. Here's just a couple of resources. There are many more that can be shared with you. The STAR Institute is actually started up in Colorado, and it has just a wealth of information, including they have a really well-known feeding clinic too. And then Sensory Kids is another one that's a really good resource. So those are just some basic touch points that I wanted to share with you on sensory integration. And I just was trying to share this in a way that maybe you could look it over in your own time and have conversations with maybe your other family members, and have some questions for myself or your other early intervention occupational therapist, just to be a starting point. So I hope that this was informative, and please feel free to email or text me any further questions. And if I'm working with your family, we will definitely continue these rich conversations and ongoing assessments to see what ways we can help your child engage with the activities that you would like him or her to with sensory processing in mind. Thank you so much for your time.